in 2008, amidst financial chaos. The Big Short spotlighted outsiders who foresaw disaster. But does the movie truly capture the real story? Join us as we uncover the truth behind the Hollywood spectacle. Are you prepared to separate fact from fiction? Mortgage-backed securities might sound like a mouthful, but they're basically like financial sandwiches made up of mortgages instead of ham and cheese. Let's break it down. Imagine you want to buy a house, but you need a loan from the bank to do it. That's where mortgages come in. Now, banks don't want to keep all those mortgages on their books because it ties up a lot of their money. So they bundle a bunch of mortgages together and sell them to investors. These bundles are what we call mortgage-backed securities. Mortgage-backed securities are like the building blocks of the financial system. They help banks free up cash to make more loans and keep the housing market flowing smoothly. Investors, like pension funds and big institutions, buy these securities because they're seen as a safe bet. After all, people usually try their best to pay their mortgages, right? In The Big Short, the movie shows how banks were churning out these mortgage-backed securities like they were going out of style. They were giving mortgages to anyone with a pulse, bundling them up, and selling them off like hotcakes. But here's the kicker. In real life, that's pretty much what happened. Banks were dishing out mortgages left and right, even to folks who couldn't afford them. They packaged these risky mortgages together, slapped a shiny AAA rating on them, thanks to some creative math, and sold them off to investors as if they were as safe as houses. Which brings us to the characters of the movie. In the movie, Michael Burry is portrayed as a genius investor who sees the housing bubble coming from a mile away. He's a bit socially awkward, but his analytical mind more than makes up for it. And hey, he's played by Bale, so you know he's got some serious acting chops. But in real life, Michael Burry is pretty much the same. He's a quirky guy with a knack for numbers and a keen eye for spotting trends. He's the one who first saw the cracks in the housing market and decided to bet big against it. And guess what? He was right. Mark Baum, played by Steve Carell, is the guy who's just fed up with all the BS on Wall Street. He's loud, he's brash, and he's not afraid to speak his mind. He's like the moral compass of the movie, calling out the fraud and greed he sees all around him. And in real life, the guy he's based on, Steve Eisman, is pretty much the same. He's a straight shooter who isn't afraid to ruffle some feathers. He saw the shady dealings in the mortgage market and decided to bet against them, even when everyone else thought he was crazy. And hey, just a fun little tidbit for you guys. Did you know that Bale actually wears a pair of cargo shorts and shirt, which is actually borrowed from Michael Burry's actual closet? Banks were handing out mortgages like candy on Halloween, but instead of giving them to responsible folks with good credit, they were giving them to just about anyone who asked. These were called subprime mortgages, and they were risky businesses because the people taking them out often couldn't afford to pay them back. Now, when enough people started defaulting on their mortgages, meaning they stopped making payments, it sent shockwaves through the housing market. Suddenly, there were all these houses up for sale, but not enough buyers. And when supply goes up and demand goes down, what happens? Prices plummet. The subprime mortgage crisis hit the housing market like a wrecking ball. Prices dropped faster than a lead balloon, leaving homeowners underwater, meaning they owed more on their mortgages than their homes were worth, and banks scrambling to recoup their losses. Millions of families lost their homes to foreclosure. Neighborhoods turned into ghost towns, and the whole economy felt the ripple effects. It was like a domino effect of financial doom, and it all started with those risky subprime mortgages. Which brings us to one of the boldest moves in the history of finance, shorting the housing market. It's like betting against the house in a game of cards, except the stakes are way higher. So, grab your popcorn and let's break it down. First off, what the heck is shorting? Well, it's a fancy way of saying you're betting that something is gonna go down in value. In the movie, our main characters, like Michael Burry, decide to short the housing market by borrowing mortgage-backed securities and selling them off, with the hope of buying them back later at a lower price. Now, credit default swaps are like insurance policies for investments. Imagine you're worried that those mortgage-backed securities you just sold are going to tank in value. You can buy a credit default swap from an insurance company, which will pay you if those securities default. It's like hedging your bets in case things go south. So, how accurate is the movie's portrayal of investors shorting the housing market and making a killing? Well, let's just say it's pretty darn spot on. The movie does a great job of showing the nerve-wracking process of betting against the biggest asset class in America. In The Big Short, they're like the bad guys in a superhero movie, except instead of wearing capes, they wear fancy suits and wield complex financial instruments. Let's dig in and see how the movie stacks up against real-life events. In the movie, Wall Street is portrayed as a den of wolves, preying on unsuspecting investors and playing fast and loose with people's money. You've got bankers bundling up crappy mortgages and selling them off as gold-plated securities, rating agencies turning a blind eye to the risks, and regulators asleep at the wheel. It's like the Wild West, but with fancy skyscrapers instead of saloons. And you know what? That's not too far from the truth. Leading up to the financial crisis, there was a whole lot of shady stuff going down on Wall Street. Banks were pushing subprime mortgages onto people who couldn't afford them, packaging them up into securities and selling them off to investors as if they were as safe as houses. And when it all came crashing down, millions of people lost their homes and their savings. Now let's compare the movie's depiction of Wall Street greed and fraud to what actually went down. Spoiler alert. It's pretty darn accurate. The financial crisis was fueled by a toxic cocktail of greed, recklessness, and outright fraud on Wall Street's part. Banks were more interested in making a quick buck than in doing right by their customers, and regulators failed to rein them in. So, let's take a moment to reflect on what we've learned and why it's so darn important. First off, let's give credit where credit's due. The Big Short does a pretty darn good job of capturing the chaos and complexity of the 2008 financial crisis. From the shady dealings on Wall Street to the ripple effects felt by everyday folks, the movie paints a vivid picture of just how messed up things got. Sure, there may be some Hollywood embellishments here and there, but for the most part, the movie stays true to the heart of the real-life events. It's a gripping tale of greed, hubris, and ultimately the human cost of unchecked capitalism run amok. But The Big Short isn't just a cautionary tale of the past, it's also a stark reminder of the dangers that still lurk in the shadows of the financial system today. It shows us that greed and recklessness are not just relics of the past, but ever-present threats that we must remain vigilant against. If you like this video, watch our other video next.